So, if you've been in the class, we've kind of been tracking the rise and fall of the kingdom's fortunes, and we were looking for a little while there at a period of substantial success during the reigns of Jeroboam II of Israel and Uzziah of Judah. But following their deaths, and because of the resurgence of the Assyrian Empire, well, things rapidly deteriorated for both kingdoms. And I say because of the resurgence of the Assyrian Empire, but as we're going to look at tonight, this is not an accident. This is not just Israel and Judah suffering because of the political fortunes of what was transpiring. Rather, this was a result of covenant unfaithfulness of God's people having forsaken Him. And so God was using the nations to oppress them. Tonight we're going to be looking at the works of two prophets. Now, I said in an earlier class, I'm not going to be foolish enough to try and cover all of Isaiah in a lesson, and I'm not going to do that. We are going to look at some broad themes in Isaiah tonight, and then we'll look a little bit closer at the book of Micah. Now, you look in the opening verses of each book, and they give you the historical context of those prophets. Isaiah mentions his prophesying his work as occurring in the reigns of Uzziah all the way through Hezekiah. Now you come to Isaiah chapter 6 and in verse 1 where we see Isaiah's call to be a prophet, a messenger for God. And it says in Isaiah chapter 6 that this was in the last year of King Uzziah's reign, so the year of his death. So really, Isaiah's work is primarily with Jotham, his son, going through Hezekiah. And then when we look at the book of Micah, Micah lists those three kings as well, Jotham, Ahaz, and then Hezekiah. Now we have looked at the reigns of Jotham and Ahaz so far. And what would we say was the climate in Judah at this time, particularly when we come to the time of Ahaz? Is Judah doing well or poorly, and why? Okay, you had a 50-50 chance on that one, so yes, Judah is not doing well. Why? Well, one, what's the character of Ahaz? He is wicked. And he goes beyond some of the standard wickedness even of the Israelite kings. And that not only does he worship the Baals, but what else does he worship and how does he worship? Molech, and what did that involve? Yes, so he had his sons pass through the fire. He offered his children in sacrifice to Molech. And we even noted that there may have been a reason for that, because oftentimes when these child sacrifices were offered, it was in times of great desperation. Well, what time of desperation did Judah face during the reign of Ahaz? Who was coming against them? I heard something. Syria and Aram and Israel. Syria, Aram, and Israel. They had aligned together and were greatly afflicting Ahaz. And in fact, when we looked at Isaiah chapter 7 is all in the context of Ahaz and Judah being extremely fearful, and God saying, no, the lands of the two nations which you fear, that being Aram or Syria and Israel, they are going to be forsaken. God was going to deliver Ahaz, and God had even offered a sign. And that sign being the virgin or the young woman conceiving, bearing child. And by the time that child would come to understand between good and evil, then the lands of the enemies that Ahaz was fearful of would be forsaken. Okay, so things are not well. But it's within this context that Isaiah and Micah are sent. And by the way, that's the last slide for the evening, because we're not going to really be showing maps and things. We're going to look at some things from both of these books, and we'll start with Isaiah. Now, Isaiah will have some references in the book to this portion of a prophecy occurring during a reign of a king. But there are two sections of the book that have historical narrative. We've already looked at the first one in chapter 7. And again, that wonderful promise which has its ultimate fulfillment in the virgin birth of Jesus, which was also given at a time to give assurance to Ahaz and to Judah that they would be delivered. The second historical narrative starts in Isaiah 36 and goes through Isaiah 39, and that all occurs during the reign of Hezekiah. We're not going to go that far tonight. We will reserve that portion and looking at some other things from Isaiah when we come to the reign of Hezekiah, which we'll be coming to here in just another week. So, we want to look at some broader themes. So I'm going to start right here in Isaiah chapter 1. Because you read the first chapter of Isaiah, and you get a sense already, okay, here's what the message is. Here is what God is trying to convey to this people. So you start in verse 2. Listen, O heavens, and hear, O earth, for the Lord speaks. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have revolted against me. An ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master's manger, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. Alas, sinful nation, people weighed down with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly. They have abandoned the Lord, they have despised the Holy One of Israel, they have turned away from Him. So it begins with, here is the Lord's complaint against His people. Common beasts recognized their master. God's people did not recognize its master. And so what would you presume would occur next in the text? God begins with this complaint against the people for their wickedness and their unfaithfulness. What's this leading to? Judgment. I'm sorry. Warning of judgment to come, and also describing here's why judgment has come already. So he asks in verse 5, where will you be stricken again as you continue in your rebellion? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart is faint. Again, when Isaiah begins his prophecy, and in this early portion of it, things are not well in Judah and Israel. Judah has been afflicted by Israel and Aram, but then Assyria is going to come in, and Assyria is going to greatly afflict both Israel and Judah. In fact, we looked at that in the reign of Ahaz. Ahaz sent to Assyria for help, and the text said, actually, Assyria was more of an affliction to Ahaz than they were a help. So these bad things are happening to God's people already. They've had judgments coming upon them. And so God is asking, have you not had enough? Are things not bad enough yet that you won't turn to me? So he continues on, verse 7, your land is desolate, your cities are burned with fire, your fields, strangers are devouring them in your presence. It is desolation as overthrown by strangers. The daughter of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a watchman's hut in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. Unless the Lord of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom, we would be like Gomorrah. In other words, it is only because of God's mercy that Israel and Judah have not suffered the fate of those two wicked cities and not left completely desolate and completely abandoned at this time. So when you read Isaiah, you're going to run across those two themes over and over again. God will have complaint against His people. God will ask, why have you been so unfaithful to me? God will reflect on the punishment they're already undergoing and warn of further punishment to come. But what else do you find in Isaiah? Hope. There is hope in Isaiah. Now here in the first chapter, you've got two kinds of hope. You've got immediate hope. What would be the immediate hope for Israel and for Judah? Okay, and what would they be required to have that? What would they need to do to have that? Okay, so if you repent, things can go well for you. So look at verse 16 of chapter 1. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Come now and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are as scarlet, they'll be as white as snow. Though they're red like crimson, they'll be like wool. If you consent and obey, you will eat the best of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you'll be devoured by the sword. Truly the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And he goes on from there to describe this judgment that would come upon them should they continue in rebellion. And so, by the way, this is the judgment that did come upon them because they rebelled. But then you have this little nugget, verse 27. Zion will be redeemed with justice, and her repentant ones with righteousness. This is all in the context of God describing the judgment that is coming upon Jerusalem. But God now is looking ahead. There is a redemption coming. And it's going to be a redemption where righteousness and justice prevail. And so when you come to chapter 2, then you have this wondrous passage about the mountain of the Lord's house being lifted up and the nations flowing to it. God is looking forward to hope in the future. So again, you can look at different verses and question whether they're about a more immediate hope or about a future hope. But these themes are throughout Isaiah. You've got warning, you've got punishment being either threatened or being commented upon, and then you've got hope. More, particularly in the latter chapters, more about a future hope than an immediate hope. Any questions or comments before we move on? Okay, also within these opening passages, you've got some fairly significant contrasts that are given. So go to chapter 5. Chapter 5, God pronounces woe on His people and gives a pretty terrible description of His people. What is the description God gives of His people at the beginning of chapter 5? What does He liken them to? Vineyard. Just any vineyard? This is my well-beloved. This is my choice vineyard. This is the vineyard that I did everything for. And what did that vineyard produce? Nothing good. Nothing good. And so what was going to happen to God's vineyard? It's going to be destroyed. He says in verse 6, well, rather verse 5, so now let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I'll remove its hedge and it'll be consumed. I'll break down its wall and it'll become trampled ground. I'll lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I'll also charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. He goes on from there to begin pronouncing a series of woes on the people. We'll just list a few of those. Verse 8, he speaks of those who add house to house. What is God commenting on? I'm sorry, Shad, go ahead.
I was going to ask, is the parable of the tenants in Mark 12 a reference to the vineyard of the Israelites?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I believe so. Jesus, in making this reference to the tenants and the idea of the master providing for everything and then nothing being produced, his audience hears that. They know this imagery has been used before.
Would the tenants and messengers be like the prophets and then the ultimate messenger is the son?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I believe so. Agree. Good point. Okay. What is the idea of adding house to house? What is God commenting on? Is it wrong to have property? Yeah. Yes, so that's certainly, that latter part is of great concern. Not only they're not giving it to the poor, but Ross, go ahead.
Say they have the allotments for everybody, so it almost seems like they're just kind of disregarding that completely and taking and forgetting that it's supposed to be shared among all the different families.
Remember, when God divided the land, which Ross was commenting on, that land was to belong to the families of Israel perpetually. If it was sold, it was not to remain sold, it was to be redeemed. And if you recall, as wicked as Ahab was, it was only after he and Jezebel conspired to murder Naboth and take his land that God then said, okay, your family is finished. Your family is going to be completely eradicated out of Israel. And so what you read here is it seems like this has now become more common. The idea of the wealthy taking what was the eternal possession from God to the people, and now they're just adding to their own possession so that they are living, as it says, alone in the midst of the land. He goes on to say in verse 13, my people go into exile for their lack of knowledge, their lack of knowledge of the will of God and of following that. Verse 20, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. So in response to all this, God then talks about what's going to happen. And he says in verse 26 of chapter 5, he says, He will also lift up a standard to the distant nation, and will whistle for it from the ends of the earth. And behold, it will come with speed swiftly. No one in it is weary or stumbles. None slumbers or sleeps, nor is the belt at its waist undone, nor its sandal strap broken. Its arrows are sharp, and all its bows are bent. The hoofs of its horses seem like flint, and its chariot wheels like a whirlwind. Its roaring is like a lioness, and it roars like a young lion. It growls as it seizes the prey and carries it off with no one to deliver it. And it will growl over it in that day like the roaring of the sea. If one looks to the land, behold, there is darkness and distress. Even the light is darkened by its clouds. Whether God was specifically alluding to Assyria or Babylon or both, the idea of these foreign invaders coming in, the point was, this is the state of God's people. This is the state of Israel and Judah. Punishment's coming. And the light is going to cease to exist there. So that's chapter 5. What's the contrast in chapter 6? What does Isaiah see? Sees God in glory and holiness. He has this image of God. And so we've gone from here's what's happening among God's people. Here's how bad things are. Here are the woes that God's pronounced upon them. Here is the judgment that's coming. And then here is God Himself. And how does Isaiah respond to this image of God, this vision of God? Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, he reflects on himself. Woe is me. I am undone. I am a person of unclean lips. So here's this, what we would assume has been a faithful servant of God up to this point even. But he sees this holy God, and Isaiah reflects on, I am unworthy. But then what is it that God is going to have Isaiah do? You're going to go and you're going to proclaim my message. And when Isaiah asks how long does God say? You can paraphrase.
Until the cities are devastated and without.
Yeah, till it's done. Till my judgment is complete. And the idea being there, Isaiah has seen the glory of God. Isaiah is repentant. But Isaiah is going to go to the people with the message of this glorious God, and they're not going to be repentant. they're not going to turn back to him. Another contrast, I think, chapter 7. We already looked at Ahaz. Ahaz being the king. Ahaz is fearful because of his iniquity and what that has brought upon him and the people with these foreign invaders, Israel and Aram. God gives him a chance to turn to him, to put his trust in him. Ahaz refuses to do so. Ahaz rather puts his trust in Assyria and gives tribute to Assyria. So you have this king, this wicked king who puts no faith and no trust in God. Well, then it's significant that Isaiah chapter 7, we are then introduced to a future king. Again, the ultimate fulfillment of the promise that's given, the sign that's given, the Emmanuel, God with us who would be born. And so later chapters then begin to comment on this future king. Chapter 9. There will be no more gloom for her who is in anguish. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. So real quick, and I guess I could have put a map up there for this. Why would God at this point single out Zebulun and Naphtali? Anybody have an idea of the geography of the tribes? Where are these tribes located? No, but like the tribes on the other side of the land of Jordan, these were two of the tribes that were subject to foreign invasion the easiest because of the far north. They're on the far northern borders of Israel. So when Syria invades, guess what's the first tribe to lose land? Zebulun and Naphtali. When the Assyrians exert their dominance and power, guess which tribes are the first to suffer? Zebulun and Naphtali. And so God is commenting on their suffering and on their anguish. But later, he shall make it glorious by the way of the sea, on the other side of Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. You shall multiply the nation, you shall increase their gladness. They will be glad in your presence, as with the gladness of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. Skip on down to verse 6. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace. On the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. I'm not going to take time to read chapter 11 as well, verses 1 through 9, where again, this coming Savior, this coming King is also specified, and the peace that was going to exist in his kingdom. But again, just put it in contrast with Judah's current king. A king who's fearful, a king who's wicked, a king who, rather than leading his people to safety and security, has brought upon them war and economic distress. And God is saying, well, here's what the future holds. And even the portions of God's land that are already in captivity, Zebulun and Naphtali, great joy is going to come to them. And so the gospel writers certainly make a point of Jesus' work being in Galilee and why his work was in Galilee. This is the area of God's land, of the land of Canaan, that had been subject to these foreign invaders first. One other contrast, and I'll open it up to any and all of your questions or comments. Throughout this section as well, as God is specifying the judgment that's going to be coming upon his people, God also makes it clear that he is the one that's behind this. And so in chapter 10, he talks about Assyria, and he calls Assyria, verse 5, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger." And so what he's doing there is he's reflecting on, yes, Assyria is going to be God's tool to punish Israel and Judah, but then Assyria is going to be punished itself. And even just a few chapters over, chapter 13, the nation that God uses to punish Assyria, Babylon, they are now the subject of God's divine justice. And that's one of these things, and we certainly won't be getting into this. When you hear people talk about various authors of Isaiah and saying that there could not have been one author of Isaiah, this is one of the reasons why, because he is commenting on a people who at this time are in no way a dominant power whatsoever. In fact, the Assyrians have quelled any and all unrest in Babylon at this time. Babylon is not a power. But Isaiah, God rather through Isaiah, is looking forward to the time when Babylon will be a power. And he's going to use them not only to punish the Assyrians, but to punish Judah. But they're going to be called into judgment. And then starting really in that chapter and going forward, you just have nation after nation, Moab, Damascus or Aram, Ethiopia, Egypt, and the list just goes on and on. God saying, all these nations are going to be judged. They're going to be judged by me. And then you come to chapter 24. And now God is not specifying any nation. He's talking about the whole earth. And so it says in verse 1, "Behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants." Verse 19, "The earth is broken asunder. The earth is split through. The earth is shaken violently. The earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, and it totters like a shack." So after God has pronounced judgment on nation after nation, God is just now looking at the whole earth. And He's saying, my judgment's coming upon it all. Why is this significant? You know, whether you want to look at it from the standpoint of Isaiah who's hearing this, or even the people who would listen to Isaiah, and if there are some faithful who would listen to Isaiah, why is it significant that God is spelling all this out? Because you need to know that God's the one in control of all this, right? When the Assyrians invade, it's not because the Assyrian gods are greater than your God. When your people are slain and your people are taken captive, it's not because your God failed. It's rather because your people broke covenant with this God who judges all the earth. And so, over and over again, God is shown to be superior to all things, to all gods, and He is the one who judges the earth. But then you come, and we'll skip over a couple chapters again, come to chapter 26. There's praise that's given in chapter 25 for God who renders this kind of judgment. And in chapter 26 you begin with, "In that day this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. He sets up walls and ramparts for security." So far, there's been so much instability. You know, God's people are going to be judged. Woe to God's people. God's choice vineyard is going to be uprooted. There's all this turmoil. There's all this chaos. And then all the nations are judged. But then God comes to the point of, but my people in my city, they're still going to say, we are safe and we are secure. And so, again, you just have all these different contrasts. The earth and all the chaos and destruction and judgment, but in the city of God, where there's safety and there's security and there's the presence of God. All right, that's what I was going to say about Isaiah tonight. And again, just to look at it in this context of what's going on in Israel and Judah. Israel and Judah are losing territory. Israel and Judah are being defeated. Israel and Judah are having economic collapse. Israel and Judah have political instability. All these things are happening, and Isaiah is telling them, here's exactly why. But here's the hope that exists for my people. So any comments, questions? Excellent. Let's talk about Micah for a second. Oh, sorry, Shad, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one point we can take from Isaiah chapter 6, comparing Isaiah and then to the apostles and to our own faith. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 11, it says, "And I said, all along the Lord, and the Lord responded with it. So cities lie waste without inhabitants, and the Lord is desolate, and the land, is desolate waste." You think about the apostles, about how Jesus tells them that you will be persecuted for my name's sake, and that the world will despise you, and they will hate you, and that you will die for my name's sake, and yet they still continue to go and do the same. And Isaiah continued to go and spread the word to Israel, even though he knew he's going to be the only one standing before them in the end, because all the cities will collapse due to their wickedness. And when it comes to the apostles' day, they would be the only ones around, because there were people literally killing them for their faith that they had in the Lord. And I think it's something that we can take is how far will we go when the Lord says we need to speak up, we need to stand up for our faith. Will we be willing to be the only one standing in the wasteland of all the things around us?
That's a very good point, Shad. If you didn't hear it, Shad is making a comparison between Isaiah and his willingness to go and fulfill God's commission, and even though this is going to be set among a people who are going to reject it, and so ultimately are all going to finally be destroyed, making comparison to the apostles and they're standing firm in the faith, even though the world by and large rejected that message, and then calling for us to look at our willingness to stand firm in the faith as well. Very good point. All right, let's just spend a couple of minutes on Micah. I put much more information about Micah in the material. Micah is significantly shorter, so it's a little easier to do that. Micah is only 7 chapters. So once again, Micah, he prophesies during these kings, Jotham through Hezekiah. Significantly, Micah's home city is listed, and when you look at some of the invasions, particularly of the Assyrian armies, Micah's home city would have lain right in their path. And that may even be reflected in some of the things that Micah says in his letter. In this book of prophecy, you've got really 3 cycles. And what I mean by that is you've got a pronouncement of doom, if you will, or of judgment. But then that's followed by a message of hope. And you've got that 3 times. And so that's why we just call it kind of a cycle of going through this idea. I think if you just read through the text, you can kind of pick up on that. But I do want to just kind of look at a few things. And so again, you kind of see the contrast of what God's doing here. He's pronouncing judgment, and here's why judgment's coming. But then you have a contrast to what God is going to be offering. So for instance, in chapter 3. Chapter 3, God starts with the rulers or leaders of the people. Hear now, heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. Is it not for you to know justice? You who hate good and love evil, who tear off their skin from them and their flesh from their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, strip off their skin from them, break their bones, chop them up as for the pot and as the meat in the kettle. Not that the leaders were actually cannibals, but the idea of their oppression of the poor had reached this level. And even going back to what we already saw in Isaiah, God pronounced woe upon those who are adding house to house. They're doing that through oppression. They're oppressing their fellow man. And this is what the very leaders of the people are doing according to Micah chapter 3. And then God goes on to the prophets in verse 5. These prophets who lead my people astray. When they have something to bite with their teeth, they cry peace. But against them who puts nothing in their mouths, they declare holy war. In other words, these prophets are bought and sold. Say something good about this prophet, give him something to eat, he'll prophesy great things for you. Give him nothing, doom and gloom. So if you want a cheery sermon on Sunday, you know what to do. Joking. JP's preaching. Ha. If you want a cheery sermon from JP, you know what to do. No. So you have this absolute failure of leadership among God's people. And so because of that, God says in verse 12, on account of you, Zion will be plowed as a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the temple will become high places of a forest. So what are the contrasts? Well, there's a couple of contrasts given. One contrast given in chapter 4, one in chapter 5. Chapter 4, God then talks about His kingdom, His house. Come about in the last days of the mountain, the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. And he starts talking about what that kingdom is going to be like. God's going to be the one who judges between many peoples, verse 3. Verse 4, each one of them is going to sit under his vine and under his fig tree with no one to make them afraid. And so you have, again, this contrast. Israel's leaders at this time are oppressing them. There's no real justice. The poor have nothing. They're being afflicted. But God is looking to a time when all that will be rectified. And my house, where all the nations can stream to it, well, I'm going to be their judge. And there's going to be prosperity, but there's going to be enough for my people. But then he goes on to talk about how God's people were going to suffer. And it's this idea of Israel is going to suffer, but through that suffering is going to come this glorious kingdom. So you kind of can fit in the captivity and the return and the travails of God's people, but ultimately through that, then the glory is going to come. And specifically, it's going to come through the birth of the ruler, in chapter 5. Muster yourselves in troops, daughter of troops. They have laid siege against us with a rod. They will smite the judge of Israel in the cheek. But as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore, He will give them up until the time. Again, this is God speaking of, here is the oppression that my people are experiencing, the judgment and the punishment for their sins. I'm giving them up for a time. But when she who is in labor has borne a child, then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. And he'll arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they'll remain, because at that time he'll be great to the end of the earth. This one will be our peace. And so God, as He's promising this kingdom, but then the reality is, okay, God's people right now are suffering. God's people right now are going into captivity. And God's saying, but yes, all this is going to bring about what I ultimately have planned. I am giving you up for a time, but then through God's people, through even Bethlehem, comes this one who's going to be ruler, and this one who's going to establish peace. So once again, just you look through those cycles and you see those things set all in this time where God's people are not faring well at all, and it's because of their iniquity. And what we'll study on Sunday morning is how God's patience finally ran out with the northern kingdom of Israel, and so we will see the fall of Israel. Thank you, everyone.